The most powerful weapon in modern history isn't a missile, a spy network, or a secret technology hidden in a bunker. It's a piece of paper, green, thin, and printed by the U.S. Treasury, a currency so ordinary that billions of people touch it every day, yet so influential that entire governments can rise, fall, or collapse depending on its movements. This is the story of how the U.S. dollar, once just another national currency, became the most dominant instrument of global influence ever created. A weapon that works without firing a shot, shaping alliances, punishing enemies, and silently steering the world economy. And it all began long before anyone realized what the dollar would eventually become. In the early 20th century, global finance revolved around gold. Currencies were tied to hard metal, and nations kept enormous reserves to stabilize their economies. But World War I shattered this system. Europe, drained by war, borrowed immense sums from the United States, and for the first time, American financial power extended far beyond its borders. Still, the dollar was not yet king. That transformation required another catastrophe. When World War II erupted, European currencies collapsed. Nations were fighting for survival, not economic stability. Their gold flowed into U.S. vaults, and by 1944, the United States held nearly two-thirds of the world's gold supply. With Europe devastated and Asia destabilized, only one economy remained standing: America's. That year, 44 nations gathered in the small town of Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, desperate to rebuild a broken world. And there, in a quiet but world-changing agreement, a new financial order was created. Currencies would be tied to the U.S. dollar, and the dollar would be tied to gold. America, with unmatched reserves, became the anchor of the global economy. The meeting lasted only a few weeks, but its consequences would last for generations. From this moment forward, global trade, investment, and reconstruction would orbit around the U.S. currency. But even this system had limits, and those limits would give birth to an even more powerful form of dollar dominance. By the late 1960s, U.S. gold reserves were shrinking. Nations began losing trust in America's ability to redeem dollars for gold. And in 1971, in a move that stunned the world, President Richard Nixon ended the convertibility of dollars into gold. Overnight, the Bretton Woods system collapsed. Economists feared global chaos. Journalists predicted the fall of the U.S. currency. But something unexpected happened. Instead of losing power, the dollar found a new kind of strength. Because the world needed something more valuable than gold: stability. And the United States, despite its flaws, remained the safest economic harbor. Its markets were deep, its economy enormous, and its military unmatched. Countries continued using dollars simply because there was no alternative. Then came the turning point that would transform the dollar from a global currency into a global weapon: oil. In 1974, America struck a quiet deal with Saudi Arabia. In exchange for U.S. weapons and military protection, Saudi Arabia would price its oil exclusively in dollars. Within a few years, every major oil producer followed. And in an energy-hungry world, this meant one thing: every country needed dollars. Every economy depended on them. And the U.S. suddenly had leverage on a scale no empire in history had ever possessed. The petrodollar system didn't just reinforce American economic dominance, it locked it in. Once the world was tied to the dollar, something else happened, something subtle but far more powerful. The United States discovered that it could use the dollar not just to influence world markets, but to shape global behavior. Not with treaties, not with armies, but through the international banking system. When the U.S. freezes assets, cuts off banks, or restricts dollar transactions, the effects are immediate and devastating. A country locked out of the dollar network can't trade freely, can't borrow cheaply, can't access global markets, and can't stabilize its currency. This became one of America's most potent tools: financial sanctions. They were used to pressure military dictatorships, halt nuclear ambitions, disrupt terror networks, and weaken rival powers. Over time, allies and institutions like the IMF and World Bank enforced the system, not out of coercion, but because the dollar-based financial order brought stability, liquidity, and predictability. Yet this influence came with a silent cost. The more the U.S. used the dollar as a geopolitical tool, the more other nations began searching for ways out of its shadow. Today, a new chapter is unfolding. China and Russia are experimenting with alternative payment systems. Countries are building currency swapping agreements to reduce reliance on the dollar. Energy exporters are quietly accepting other currencies. And discussions of de-dollarization have reached global headlines. Yet despite these efforts, nearly 60% of global foreign exchange reserves remain in dollars. Most international trade, from electronics to food to transportation, is still priced in dollars. Over 80% of global currency transactions involve the dollar. And during every major crisis, from the 2008 collapse to the pandemic, nations rush to hold more dollars, not fewer. Because the dollar is not just a currency, it is a system, a network, a habit built over decades. Habits on a global scale do not break easily. The real power of the dollar lies not in American decree, but in global dependence. As long as trust in U.S. institutions remains stronger than trust in any alternative, the dollar's influence endures. But history offers a warning. Every dominant currency before the dollar, the British pound, the Dutch guilder, the Venetian ducat, eventually declined. Not from sudden collapse, but from slow erosion, debt rising, rivals strengthening, and global confidence shifting. The question is not whether the dollar will lose influence someday, but how, and how quickly. For now, the dollar remains the world's financial North Star, a quiet weapon disguised as a banknote, symbol of stability for some, and control for others. A tool that can build prosperity or exert pressure without firing a single shot. As long as it commands the world's trade, energy, and financial systems, it will continue shaping the balance of power in the modern age. The story of the dollar is the story of influence without force, strategy without soldiers. How a simple currency became the strongest geopolitical tool of the 21st century.